In the trailers for my media text, I use many different codes and conventions, as well as representing social groups and issues. But I also broke many conventions of the genre of my film at the same time, and that genre I chose to portray was fantasy. Fantasy is a very famous and popular genre with lots of well-known codes and conventions. Many of these are key in defining the genre and would therefore be necessary to include them in order to represent the key themes of a fantasy story. However, there are many conventions that I did not keep in my film, either because they are outdated or because I wanted to try something new. The main convention I used was setting. Most fantasy films have a medievalist setting. For example, Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy, based on J.R.R. Tolkien's novels, were a huge influence on The Lost Key, and one of the main factors of this was the introduction of a make-believe world set in the distant past. This is what I did when I set my film in a medievalist world of my own. By filming in the countryside, keeping it away from modern urban areas, and set in the climax of the ruins of a castle, I managed to present a fantasy world that kept with convention and would be familiar to the audience. Another convention I chose to keep was the use of mythical animals, in this case dragons. Dragons are probably the most famous fantasy creature and appear in many other media texts, such as the How to Train Your Dragon franchise. So, I felt that using a CGI implemented one at the end of my theatrical trailer would be good in keeping with convention, as well as remaining appealing and entertaining to the audience. It also kept in convention with the trailer, as often, in more modern trailers, they end in cliffhangers or with dramatic blackouts, so as to intrigue the audience and convince more people to watch the film. The final famous convention I used was having a young teenage protagonist. Many fantasy texts are aimed at a younger target demographic. This is because oftentimes fantasy stories are told to children and therefore, to create a more relatable character, I used a younger actor. This goes with convention, as in films such as the Chronicles of Narnia franchise, the four main protagonists are children or young adults, so therefore I felt it was a good idea to introduce a younger protagonist. However, I also used a younger antagonist, which defies convention, as oftentimes, when there is a younger protagonist, to combat them there is an older antagonist, which ties in to Levi Strauss's theory of binary opposition, this particular example being old versus young. The choice to make the antagonist younger was a conscious one, as I felt that it balanced the two opposing sides by having them more relatable to each other, as well as being relatable to the younger target demographic. In terms of social issues and groups represented, I chose to break convention and to make the main protagonist of my film female. This is something that does not happen often in fantasy films, as it is usually a strong male character that is used in this genre. For example, in the BBC television series Merlin, two of the main characters are male. As you can see here, the only strong female characters are either the antagonist or secondary side characters. This is because traditionally, in this genre, female characters were presented as weak or as plot devices, with the stereotypical damsel in distress trope coming from fantasy stories. However, there have been some examples of lead female protagonists, such as in The Golden Compass. Here, the writers use a young female as the main character, which is similar to what I would go on to do. I decided to break this convention because I felt that it would work better with a modern audience to have a strong female character in my film as the main protagonist. Altogether, there are many codes and conventions that I left in, but there were also many that I challenged and broke. This kept the film recognisable as a fantasy, but it also created a different viewing experience, as there are many factors that would defy expectation for the audience.